am not recording, so
Oh, you're not
that is
recording.
the first. So now I am recording.
Okay,
Sorry
you can
about
start
all
over.
of
Start over again. Okay, it's no problem.
So greetings, everybody. I am here. Very lucky to have Carrie Hessler. Excuse me one second, to be here with Carrie Hessler-Radelet, who is currently the CEO for Project Concern International, an NGO that I have admired for many years, especially when I was in the field, and who is also the former director of Peace Corps, which is my favorite agency that all of our taxpayer money goes to, because I myself am a returned Peace Corps volunteer. So Carrie, thank you so much for being here with us.
It is a pleasure and a privilege.
And thank you. And so just to start with, can you let us know your background so we know how you got to be where you are today, or at least some of the high elements of it?
Sure, absolutely. Well, Lynn, like you, I got my start as a Peace Corps volunteer. My husband, Steve, and I served as volunteers in Western Samoa in the Pacific. We were there in the early 80s, and I taught at an all-girls Catholic school. And it was where I really learned the importance of investing in women and girls on one hand. And it was also the place that I found my passion for public health. And we can talk about that a little bit more in a moment because there's a great story there. But just quickly in terms of my career. So I was a volunteer for a couple years. I came back and worked at Peace Corps at the recruiting office in Boston as a public affairs specialist. So really highlighting the stories of Peace Corps volunteers from the New England area and promoting Peace Corps during its 25th anniversary. And then I went overseas and lived in the Gambia and started doing what has become my life's work, which is public health. For the first 10 years, I worked primarily with traditional birth attendants. So these are largely untrained, mostly women who assist pregnant women around the world. Their knowledge is indigenous. And at the time when I was in the Gambia, about 95% of all births were attended by a traditional birth attendant. So what my work was working with them to make sure they were connected to the health system and were able to bring women at high risk into the health system, because otherwise those women would have absolutely no interaction with the formal health system. I got a master's in public health from Harvard School of Public Health, and then lived for about 4.5 years in Indonesia, where for 2 years, I did largely the same thing, working with traditional birth attendants, and then I started working on HIV/AIDS. So maternal and child health and HIV/AIDS were the technical content of my work. Starting in Indonesia, I started doing more policy-related work. I helped Indonesia develop its first national policy and plan for HIV/AIDS. Came back and had the good fortune of being able to work with the brand new Office of Global AIDS Coordinator to develop the PEPFAR strategic plan, the first one that was presented to Congress for the very first funding of PEPFAR, and really would have continued on in my career in public health if I hadn't gotten a very faithful phone call from Harris Wofford asking me if I'd like to be considered for a leadership position at Peace Corps, which had never crossed my mind, to be honest with you. But I talked to Harris about it. I really thought hard about what I wanted out of life and decided that I couldn't possibly turn down an invitation from the Obama White House to serve in a leadership capacity at Peace Corps. So I was the deputy director for 2 years, and then I went on to serve first as acting and then the Senate confirmed director of the Peace Corps for 5 years total. And it was an extraordinary experience and a real highlight in my life and just a remarkable privilege. Then at the end of the Obama administration, I had the opportunity to come over here to PCI, Project Concern International, an organization that I first met in Indonesia when I was working there in the early 90s, an organization that is truly committed to helping to unleash power and potential at the community level so that people can lift themselves out of poverty. I was drawn to PCI because of our very intentional approach to working with communities. It reflected very much what I learned at Peace Corps and what I knew to be truly sustainable and long-lasting and empowering. So I've been at PCI in the CEO role for about 2 years now, in fact, almost exactly 2 years. And I just love it. It's an amazing organization, and I work with extraordinary people around the world.
Thanks. It's interesting to me that, you know, some of the critical points of your, I mean, the critical points in the world, you were there, like the HIV, having to work with women and children and HIV, that was new. And then the PEPFAR, thank you very much for your work on that. That's been so instrumental in Africa.
Yeah.
Best thing the Bush administration did. So that, I didn't know that. That was, you know,
yeah, it's true.
like
When I went to the Gambia, it was 1986, and we were just identifying the magnitude of the AIDS epidemic in Africa. And so, you know, it was a pivotal time. There was so much work to be done. It was a privilege.
And then the other thing that I'm noticing from your story is so you're very technical, you're immersed in the technical part of your work. I'm sure you're learning things and advancing your knowledge and advancing others' knowledge. And then the shift to the leadership side. And in Peace Corps, you had to, especially way broader than just your area of expertise. Was that a easy transition, or how did that feel for you?
Yeah. You know, I have to say that along my career, there have been many people who have helped me along the way. I spent 21 years with JSI, John Snow Incorporated, which is a very large public health consulting group that also has a nonprofit branch. So I worked in both the for-profit and the nonprofit. And at a fairly young age, the president, Joel Lamstein, gave me quite a lot of leadership opportunity. I became the director of the Boston International Group, and then eventually the director of the Washington, D.C. office, and then eventually vice president. And so I would say that I had the opportunity to lead from the time I was quite young, in my early 30s, because I was given opportunities to lead. So even though I was still working in a technical area and was still delivering technical assistance, I was also leading teams. And I think the important thing from, you know, to learn from that experience is that where you work and who you work with is so very important. And I was fortunate in my life because I was given opportunity by other extraordinary leaders. So even though when I went to Peace Corps, it was very different in many ways. I had never run a federal agency. I had worked only briefly for the government when I was when I worked at the recruiting office at Peace Corps. Right out of Peace Corps service, I had no idea how to manage a federal agency. And so from that perspective, it was so valuable to be able to work alongside Aaron Williams, who was the Peace Corps director when I was deputy, because he really taught me how to lead within a government agency. So then 2 years later, I was able then to take up the helm as director. And I don't think I would have been able to do that very effectively if I had come straight out of the private sector into government. I did go from a focus area that was primarily public health into a much broader range of development sectors, because Peace Corps works in 6 sectors, because we, you know, it's an agency that delivers whatever the needs of the community are. And, you know, community needs are various and multi, and individuals, we have to relate to individuals as wholes. And so I was able then to expand my technical knowledge to areas beyond public health, which has really been wonderful, and which has allowed me now in my role at PCI to be able to oversee a portfolio of programs that's much broader than health, although health is one of our components. So, you know, having experience is probably the best way to learn anything. You just jump in and you learn by doing. And happily throughout my life, there have been people who have been willing to take chances on me, including the White House when they offered me that role as deputy director.
Yeah, there's so much there that you said. Like some of the things that I wrote down are, you know, people who gave you the opportunity to lead, and being with people that you could learn from and grow. And then the other, being willing for your own self to jump in, even though you didn't know. I've never worked in this kind of organization before for a federal agency, but having the courage or the chutzpah or the whatever to just say, let's try this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Is there anything more you could say about being with the right people? Like, is there anything that, some has control over that? You leave if it's not the right people, or make sure that if they are the right people, you pull out of them everything that you can. I don't know if there's anything in there that you learned about that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would say that probably the most important decision you make when you're considering employment is who it is you're going to work with. And it's not only the organization itself, but that is an important consideration, because every organization has an organizational culture. And so you want to know whether or not this is a culture that supports employees, that is committed to a mission, that is going to respect people no matter what their job title, that is going to look for opportunities for professional growth and development, where people are nice to each other and practice kindness on a regular basis. All of these are so important when you are considering where you're going to spend so much time. We spend so much time at work. So looking at the organizational culture, first of all, is very important. But then second of all, looking at the people with whom you will be working, because having a leader who supports you and gives you new opportunity, gives you, willing to take risks, to give you a piece of work that you've never done before, but one that will help you grow in your career potential. All of these are so important, because an effective manager or leader can really accelerate your career. And at the same time, an ineffective manager can really dampen your career and dampen your motivation and make it difficult to feel excited about coming to work. So I often speak to students I'm still asked to do that on a fairly regular basis. And the two things I say are, really look into the organizational culture of the organization you're considering, and think seriously about the person you're going to be working with most closely, especially the person to whom you will report, because that relationship is critical. And then I think the third part is, your peers and the kind of culture you have in working together, which is also very critical. We spend so much time at work. It ought to be time where you can exercise your skills and talents and be passionate so that you can make a difference in this world. There's so much work to do.
And if it's not a good fit, then for whatever reasons, move on, because then you're not using your gifts and talents, or they're not able to pull them out of you, right?
Exactly, yeah. If it's just not a good fit, it does not mean that it's a failure. It just means that it's not a good fit, and then you should move on as quickly as you possibly can. Because staying in a place where it is not a good fit can be extremely demoralizing and difficult, and can cause you to doubt yourself.
Do you see things like, so I'm particularly interested in what information we want to share with young women that are coming up. Do you see anything that you wish that young women would do, or not any young women would do differently in leadership? Is there anything that you think, gosh, I wish we were a little bit more whatever?
I do think the idea of believing in oneself, and being courageous to take a step into the unknown are two things that I think, two messages that I'd love to impart to any women. I think that women in general, girls, it starts at a very early age, where we're not trained to take chances. We're not trained to believe in ourselves particularly. But as leaders, we are required to stand up and be courageous and take a stand and step forward. So, whenever I meet women leaders, and actually women are such good leaders when they are willing to step forward, it's just, have courage to take the first step, even when the outcome is not secure. And I think we all need to make sure that we're focused more on the impact of what we're trying to do and less whether or not we're going to get approval from society or those around us. We're also trained, we're socialized to want to please other people. And I think that, what we really need to focus on is what needs to be done and how can I do that in a way that is going to be most uplifting, that's going to have greatest impact, that's going to create the kind of culture. I think that's the other thing is, because women tend to be nurturing, this is a generalization, but I think women leaders have an extraordinary ability to create a culture that is nourishing and supportive, and that's the kind of place that I hope most women will seek to, well, any leader ought to be seeking to create an environment where others will thrive. The best leaders bring people up with them. They lift others with them. They're not threatened by others. I guess I want to say one more thing about fear, because fear is our greatest enemy for anyone. But fear also can be a powerful motivator. It can help us grow. And anytime we do anything that we've never done before, we're going to feel those butterflies in our stomach. But, we need to overcome that. We need to be able to take that step in confidence. Leadership is really all about doing things that you've never done before and having the confidence to believe in yourself and those around you that you can make a difference. And so the whole idea of having courage and overcoming fear, I think, is really important. And I think it's especially important for women.
And you and I were talking about courage. I'm just looking at my notes, and we were talking about some of what is, my question for you earlier, what does courage have to do with leadership? And you were saying how much you liked that question. You were talking about some experiences that you had in Peace Corps.
Yeah, I know, that's right. There are a couple of other things that I think go hand in hand with courage, and one of those is vulnerability and authenticity. I think if you're going to be an effective leader, you've got to be willing to be vulnerable and you've got to be willing to be authentic. And that leads you to a very uncomfortable spot sometimes.
These are my favorite topics.
Yeah.
Vulnerability, courage, authenticity.
Authenticity, it's what allows you to be an authentic leader that people can relate to. And for me, probably the most difficult time I've ever experienced as a leader was shortly after I arrived at the Peace Corps. I was a deputy director, and only just a few weeks after I had arrived, we received notification that the television program 2020 was going to do a program on, well, first of all, the murder of an extraordinary Peace Corps volunteer in Benin, and second of all, sexual assault in the Peace Corps. And really the reason they were knit together was a storyline that Peace Corps was not supporting its volunteers adequately, and especially its women. And so I got thrust into that first media storm, but even more importantly, it was clear to me that we needed to do things differently than we had ever before. And the reason I knew that was because when I was a Peace Corps volunteer, I had been sexually assaulted, and I had never told anyone. I actually had been sexually assaulted by a member of the Peace Corps staff.
Oh my.
And I had never told anyone. 30 years later, I had never told anyone. And so I knew that sexual assault was an issue that was very much real within the Peace Corps environment, as it is everywhere. I mean, it's part of, human, what it means to be human is, there are problems related to sexual assault. But I also knew that with Peace Corps, actually, I shouldn't say I didn't tell anyone. I finally did tell Peace Corps, and after it had happened 3 times to me, and Peace Corps had done nothing about it. And so I knew that Peace Corps had a problem dealing with sexual assault. And so I first needed to become vulnerable enough to both revisit my own sexual assault, but second of all, raise my own experience so that in that experience I could use that as a way to be able to draw near to other volunteers who had been assaulted, men and women, because men are also sexually assaulted, but also as a way to making the issue real so that our agency could deal with it on a real basis. And that was tremendously difficult. I had to come out to my family, to my children, to other volunteers with whom I had served, to the greater Peace Corps community with my own personal story that I had really never revealed, except for I wrote a report just as I was about to leave Peace Corps at 30 years previously. So being willing to be vulnerable in a very difficult and public space was the hardest thing I've ever had to do as a leader. But it also opened the door for people to feel comfortable sharing their stories with me. It became a platform upon which I could have a very honest conversation with our staff about the services that we provided to volunteers. It became a way for me to speak to the Peace Corps community about this issue and open a dialogue that was honest and open, that allowed others to also participate in an authentic way. And so, and I would also say that that experience around developing a sexual assault risk reduction and response program at Peace Corps became the platform upon which a whole series of reforms were developed. I mean, and we were able to craft it into a very broad-reaching reform agenda that it didn't center around sexual assault risk reduction response, but once you start putting the volunteers at the center of every single thing you do, which is what we needed to do at Peace Corps, it then allowed us to see other places where reform was needed. And so from that perspective, it was catalytic.
So you did it, it sounds like, for the greater good, for what it could help Peace Corps with and the volunteers. So you're willing to come out and tell your story for that. And I imagine it changed you also somewhat, somehow. Did it?
The telling of the story changed me, but it also empowers me because I do believe there is a healing power of truth telling that is important. And that's the essence of the Me Too movement. I think, ironically, I continue to be very active in this space. So now, as the president and CEO of PCI, I'm also very involved within the larger NGO community, and especially in collaboration with Interaction in a movement really to get the NGO community to be committed to preventing sexual harassment, abuse, and assault at the workplace. And so it really, Interaction has taken a great deal of leadership in this area. I'm a co-champion there along with Abby Maxman of Oxfam and the extraordinary staff at Interaction. And we've developed a pledge which now more than 100 CEOs have signed to prevent sexual exploitation, harassment, and abuse in the workplace. We're now developing policies and programs that will address the core issues, the root causes of sexual assault, which have a lot to do with power imbalance and lack of equity and disparity and discrimination of all kinds. Within PCI, it has been a catalytic movement as well, because we are thinking differently about how we promote professional growth and development. We are beginning with something called the Dignity Initiative, which really is focused on honoring the dignity and common humanity of all of our staff, but also the communities and people with whom we work. And so we're trying to weave together an approach to honoring dignity as the foundation of everything we do. And a lot of what I learned about dignity came from dealing with this very tough and very raw and very emotional issue of sexual assault, harassment, and abuse, as well as the other one of the other major initiatives at Peace Corps was an initiative around diversity and inclusion, which was also very important. Peace Corps represents the American people, and when I came into the Peace Corps, while there had been many wonderful, I think, ways of trying to create a more diverse volunteer and staff, there was much more we can do. And so that became a big focus of my administration as well, is really trying to represent the incredible richness of the American people in all of its forms. So anyway, weaving that all together is now what I'm thinking about most as a leader.
I so appreciate you sharing this story about your own call to courage, to put it that way, and so personal. It wasn't like you tripped on a curb and you were embarrassed. It's like something that's very difficult to share out like that in such a wide forum. It makes me a little emotional thinking of it, and doing it for the greater good, for what it could, the impact that you wanted to have, willing to take that step. And it's such a great example of what courage looks like. You're afraid. You didn't say that, and I assume that you were
No,
afraid.
I was terrified. To be honest with you, I was absolutely terrified.
Yeah.
And I was embarrassed, and I think that's one of the things that happens when you're assaulted, is that often we blame ourselves first, and I think women are especially vulnerable to this, as we say, what did I do that caused this, when in fact the perpetrator is 100% responsible for it. But
Right.
that is our first reaction.
And I can think of so many of my own examples where I'm like, that was my fault, I'm so sorry. Yeah. So, which is another thing, watch what we're saying to ourselves that's getting in the way of us moving forward. And the example of the courage that took, and overcoming the fear and doing it anyway, and look at the results there, the ripples on the pond, you and others, it's still going strong. I mean, you're still having an impact in something that's important to you, that if you'd stayed silent, you wouldn't have had the same platform.
Yeah, I mean, the flip side of that is failure, and being willing to risk failure in order to do something well, and in order to make a difference. And
let's talk about failure. What about failure?
Failure is a fact of life, and actually we learn more from our failures than we do from our successes. And I've had my share of failures, as has everybody. When I look back in my life, probably the failure that I most regret was my failure to report loudly when I was first sexually assaulted. And because my silence allowed that person to continue to assault for a number of years. And I, to this day, think if I had spoken up loudly, would other volunteers have raised their voice along with me? Because other people were also assaulted by this man. If I had spoken up more loudly to Peace Corps, would Peace Corps have been forced to deal with this issue more effectively earlier on than it did? So I think speaking out against injustice, we must find the courage to do that. And when we can't, we have to recognize that in silence, we are allowing that. We are in some ways complicit with that. And so that is the failure that I most regret. I was a young woman. The culture was such that there was, and also Peace Corps had no provision for sexual assault. Mm-hmm. There was no reporting mechanism. And I also think we need to be gentle with ourselves and not beat ourselves up. But when I look back on my life, that is the thing that I most regret. But, failure is the flip side of courage. And we have to be willing to take chances, knowing that sometimes things are not going to go the way we plan. And being willing to sometimes make mistakes, and mistakes that may cost something, in order to be able to achieve great things. And so I just think as a leadership principle, we have to, along with accepting courage, promoting courage, we have to also be willing to embrace failure and all that we learn from it. Failure only is a failure if you don't learn something from it. But if you learn something from it and you can course correct, then that failure becomes a stepping stone to real progress.
And I think that without willing to risk failure, then it's something like I have an image in my mind of like jumping over a stone. If you don't, you're not going to make big strides. I think that's what I'm seeing in my mind's eye. If you just do little, if I'm only going to allow this much space for failure, then this is how much success you're going to have. So you have to have, you have to be willing to fail big to have big rewards. Something that's what's coming up for me. Does that make sense?
No, that does make a lot of sense to me. I think especially for women and women leaders, I think we are less likely to believe in ourselves. I think that women probably in general have to be a little more courageous or just be willing to take a little more risk because just because of the way we're socialized. My hope is that is changing now, that this next generation of young women is just as courageous as men. I mean, I do actually see the young women leaders that I see are incredibly on fire and really confident, and that just gives me great joy. I don't see in them the timidness that I felt myself as a young leader. So I do think you have to be willing to step ahead when you really don't know where that step is going to land you.
And to circle back to something you said earlier, and to not give up pleasing everyone, you still have to take that step.
Yeah.
So
there's a quote that I remember from long, long ago. I used to live in Boston for a number of years, and there was a billboard on the highway, and it said, basically what it said is, don't waste your time by comparing yourself to other people, because in doing so, you'll either become vain or resentful. And I think that is such good advice. Do whatever you do because it's good for you. Don't compare yourself too much to other people, because if you do, you either will become proud of your own achievements, or you will become, you will lack courage because you'll say that everyone else is so much better than me, so much stronger, what have you. You'll become resentful. And so, I just think we need to figure out what's best for us and then take that step with courage.
And stay on with our vision and our path, which is not going to be like the two people on either side of us, right?
Exactly.
Carrie, I wanted to make sure that we had time to talk about what you're doing at at Project Concern. You and I were talking about how you're doing some innovative thinking and how you create a workplace, and I want to make sure that we didn't miss that.
Yeah, thank you so much. What really drew me to PCI is our intentional way of working with communities, and what we really believe and what we know to be true is that intellect, talent, and motivation is equally distributed around the world, but opportunity is not. And so it becomes our obligation really to work with communities to be able to unleash their natural talent, the incredible assets that are there, and then, assist as needed with the training, tools, access to resources. So, focusing on intentional capacity building at the community level is really an important part of what we are doing. One thing I'm especially excited about, we have, a new partnership around community-driven development, and especially something that I really am learning actually from Wendy Kopp, which is around collective leadership, which is ensuring that there is capacity built at every point in every step of the way, starting from the community level up to the national or international level, where we're really building capacity for leadership at every single point, because that is what's going to be truly catalytic. That's what's going to be truly sustainable, and that's what's really going to build and propel societies forward in the future. So that's one thing, is just the content of our work. We do health, we do food security, we do humanitarian assistance, we do everything we do has a gender lens. So that's the content of our work, but it is really focused on building skills and tools and capacity so that communities can lead their own development. So that's the actual content of our work. In terms of the way we manage, I mentioned earlier the Dignity Initiative, which is really which is a brand new thing, actually, and we're at the very early stages of it. So it's aspirational at this perspective, but it's really our approach to ensuring that we're creating a workplace where people can thrive, where there's professional development and coaching, where it's a safe environment, so that we have child protection, and where we're able to prevent any kind of harassment or abuse of any kind, where we're creating a learning environment, and where people are kind to each other and really honor each other's dignity. We're doing some very interesting things around coaching. We're starting in Tanzania, which I'm excited about, really a very purposive approach to coaching our field staff. Oftentimes organizations invest first in the headquarters staff, but in terms of this coaching initiative, it's starting in the field, and I really love that. And so we're learning from this experience in Tanzania. So workplace development and creating the kind of culture where we all will thrive is very important to me personally. And then the other thing that we're doing is looking to the future and understanding that the development sector is at a very disruptive time right now. We have a president that continually calls for a 30% reduction in foreign assistance. So and even though Congress restores it, it does introduce a level of volatility into our sector. And at the same time, there are lots of new players in the development sector. There are impact investors. There are corporations that are interested in shared value. There are new social enterprises, some of which could complement our work. Some represent some competition to the nonprofit sector. I think we all want to be learning from each other. If we have as our end goal the impact in the field and really the sustainable development of societies around the world, where people are able to lead, then we want to collaborate as much as we possibly can and learn from each other. So within that disruptive space, we're trying to figure out how we should organize ourselves, whether or not we should pursue more market-driven approaches to funding. We are looking at new funding partners. We're working with nonprofits in different ways. We're exploring possibilities of business combination. So we're really taking a look at that disruptive international development field in an effort to chart our path forward in a way that allows us to deliver most effectively on impact while also remaining financially sustainable. So I threw a lot of things at you, but basically we're looking at focusing on our technical work to make sure that it is empowering communities and building capacity for leadership at the community level. We are looking at our own workplace culture and trying to develop a culture that honors the dignity of each person. And then we're also trying to adapt our organizational structure and our business model so that we can deliver greatest impact, but also remain financially sustainable.
So you just have a few things on your plate. Nothing big.
Well, when I went into PCI, it was actually my first foray into the NGO sector. When I was at JSI was partially a nonprofit, but it wasn't an NGO. And so I came to PCI with very little experience, really, what it means to lead a nonprofit. And I receive so much help and support from my peer CEOs. I find a level of collaboration and support among the nonprofits in our sector to be really refreshing and wonderful. And I've been so grateful to my fellow CEOs who are willing to help me along the way, share their strategies, talk to me about what's working and what's not working. Having the support of peers is so critical.
And that I know from these interviews how every single CEO I've talked to is like in this huge change effort, both internally and the way that they're doing business, the vision they have and what they're trying to create. That something's going, you know, I think it feels new to me. It feels very like we have to find an innovative, different way of doing our work. Yeah, it's just interesting to me. I don't know if it's a new crop of CEOs or what the through line would be. And
well, I think the environment is changing, and if we don't adapt,
right.
We will fail to thrive. But
Yeah.
I think this new and changing environment causes us, or the only way to respond to it really is to be adaptive. And I think there's a lot of adaptation happening right now in our sector. And I mentioned some of the things we're doing. I think we have to be more focused than ever before because resources are very tight. And I think that with social media, the options out there, I mean, there's so many options, there's so much information that you can become overwhelmed and lost by possibility. And so you just really need to focus and keep your eye on what's most important. And then and related to the first is just, you've got to be really strategic because with limited resources, limited time, you have to focus on where you can have greatest impact.
I'm sure that sounds like exactly right what you're saying. And when I listen to you, I'm so excited to hear what you're doing. And I want there to be a chapter 2 in our discussion because I want to know what happens on your technical side, what happens with the dignity. You're going to learn so much. You know, will the communities, leadership in the communities, the dignity in the workplace. I mean, some of it, you're going to learn so much. So we're going to want to get that out. I'm sure you are going to share in many ways, but that will be a good learning for everybody. And then the whole funding issue and who you're going to partner with, it's going to be a whole new book that you're writing.
Oh, there we go.
We're almost up on our time. Is there anything that we haven't touched on that you were hoping that we would?
Just to say, I believe that this generation of new leaders is coming into the workplace with more skill and expertise and knowledge and savvy than any generation before them. I think it offers incredible opportunity for the future, and I feel very optimistic and hopeful when I meet the young people who I have both in my organization, but also who I meet in universities that are just graduating. There is such strength and power and focus there. And so I am hopeful for the future. We have some tremendous issues, and unfortunately, I think especially the issue of climate change is one that we have failed. We have failed on, and it's something that my own organization, PCI, when I mentioned some of the technical work that we're doing, climate change and adaptation mitigation is something that we are very concerned about. But I do believe that the intellect, the motivation, the savvy of young leaders is going to chart a path forward and absolutely must. I feel hopeful. I feel hopeful.
That gives me hope then also, because that's what we need and what we want, and we need to remind them what you already said. We got to have a lot of courage and we have to be willing to fail. So
that's right.
So Carrie, I so much appreciate this talk with you. I appreciate your vulnerability, you're willing to share your stories. I appreciate your leadership that you have already done out in the world and what you've created. So thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us.
It is my pleasure, and thank you so much for inviting me.
You're very welcome.
It's been wonderful.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Okay, don't go. So thank you, Carrie, for that. As with many of these interviews, there's so many places that I wish, you know, if we were just sitting around talking, I would want to ask you more about. So I really do appreciate your leadership. That's from the bottom of my heart. I really am looking forward to seeing what you do at Project Concern. So it will be a learning for everybody, and that will be good, both your successes and where things don't work out the way you hoped.
Yeah, thank you.
Do you have any thoughts for me on who you would also hope that I interview?
Do you have any young people? I mean, I think of some extraordinary younger leaders who are, you know, not as advanced as I am in age, but who have tremendous wisdom and are really thinking outside of the box.
I don't know how young is young for you. Probably nobody under 50 at this point.
Well, I can think of several I would love to recommend.
That'd be excellent.
Should I just email them to you?
That would make it the easiest, yeah.
Yeah, why don't I do that? Because
Okay.
I just think there are some extraordinary leaders who are earlier in their career but have a lot to talk about, especially about leading in this time.
This is why I love to ask people for who they would recommend, because people keep adding for me in my thinking. So thank you. I would love that.
Yeah.
That'd be good. And then finally, if this went okay for you, if you enjoyed it, if you would say a few words about how you would recommend it to others.
Sure. Let me just say that I had a wonderful conversation with Lynn, and I know that thinking about some of the issues of leadership in my own life and the opportunities I had for leadership and what about today needs to change in order to be successful in a complex world, all of those things I think caused me to reflect in a way that I hadn't before. And so I was grateful for the opportunity and highly recommend it for anyone who is interested in either examining their own leadership or learning more from others who are extraordinary leaders.
Thank you. Thank you, Carrie. I really am so grateful to you. This has been a great conversation. So
thank you. It was lots of fun. I appreciate the opportunity.
You'll be hearing from me as we go back and forth on this video. So
wonderful. Thanks a lot.
Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.